loosely based around the 1980 EJ paper by Tony Atkinson and Agnar Sandmo on the welfare implications of the taxation of savings. You know, it's reproduced in this wonderful issue that everybody's got a free copy of. And in that issue, they've got Auerbach's discussion or commentary on the paper as well as the paper itself. And we've got two terrific speakers. Alan Auerbach from Berkeley is going to kick off. Hardly needs any introduction. Much work, of course, on intergenerational issues, taxation of capital and consumption, almost exactly where the Atkinson Sanmo paper sits. And we also have Mikhail Golosov from Princeton, one of the key leaders, really, in the new public finance work on optimal taxation of earnings and capital. And I know already they both have fantastic papers to present. Unfortunately, Tony Atkinson, who was going to be here to kind of discuss or comment and lead the discussion, can't be here today. So I've agreed to say, kind of start the discussion, if I can think of something good to say. I've put a couple of slides together. So save your questions to the end, and we'll have a discussion in the remaining few minutes. So let's begin with Alan's talk, and then follow immediately by Mikhail, and perhaps have a discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be here at my first Royal Economic Society meeting, and in particular to talk about the paper by Tony Atkinson and Agnar Sanmo. This is a paper that I read when it first was written in one of its early drafts, around the time I was finishing my own PhD dissertation at Harvard in the late 1970s. It was eventually published in 1980, but I think I probably saw a version of it a year or two before that. And it was a paper very close to, in many ways, to things I was working on myself at the time, a paper in my own dissertation. And of course, relates very much to work, as Richard said, work I've done in the years since then. And it was a very interesting experience to go back and read the Atkinson Sanmo paper in preparation for writing the review for the EJ, because I had thought I had processed the paper completely when I read it, and I put it aside, and I hadn't looked at it again for perhaps 3 decades. And so when I looked at it again, I realized that there were many things in there that, well, I perhaps thought I understood them or got the import of them when I read the paper originally. I realized I hadn't, or else perhaps equally likely I had just forgotten. But in any way, it was a lot of fun to go back and think about how that paper anticipated some things in the literature. Of course, in other respects, there were things in there that related to other pieces of the literature that were contemporaneous that weren't drawn out, perhaps even though they were there for perhaps a reader looking at it 10 or 20 years later, 30 years later, one could make the connections. The connections were not so obvious at the time as things were being developed simultaneously. I'll try to mention some of those things as I go along. The outline for my comments here is just briefly what we knew, I guess I should say what we thought we knew before the Atkinson and Sanmo paper was written, what we learned from Tony and Agnar, what we've learned since then, and what we still need to learn. Of course, that could be a very long paper, the last topic. But I will just mention a couple of questions that strike me as important in this area that are still pretty unresolved. So what we knew before Atkinson and Sanmo, I should say even before getting to this slide, there was a sense, perhaps before the 1970s, early 80s, that a broad-based income tax was the right way to have a progressive tax system, that income was income, income from labor, income from capital, it didn't matter, it was all the same, and all that was relevant, one could certainly think about behavioral distortions, but what was relevant was thinking about the trade-off between equity and efficiency, And there wasn't really a lot of thinking about the distinction between labor and capital income. Of course, that distinction became of paramount importance in the years that followed, particularly in this paper, but in many others as well. And it's now hard to think back to that period when the broad-based income tax, in the eyes of people like Joe Peckman and others, was sort of the gold standard for taxation. So there are two branches of the existing optimal tax literature as of 1980, the Ramsey tax approach and the Murley's approach to optimal taxation. Ramsey, of course, focusing on efficiency, and Murley's taking distribution and all issues into account. Now, in either case, the basic story could be analyzed by using a three-good model, labor plus two consumption goods, and introducing saving by conceiving of one of the consumption goods as, in the way that Arrow and DeBreux did, as one of the consumption goods as simply being consumption at a different date. And using that, you could, in either from the Ramsey approach or the Murley's approach, derive results regarding the taxation of saving. So if we think about there being two taxes, taxes on labor income, taxes on capital income, TW and TR, then we have a simple two-period budget constraint. If W is the wage, R is the rate of return to capital, the net rate of return to capital, as seen here, where there's an implicit price for second-period consumption that is determined by the after-tax interest rate. The lower the after-tax interest rate, the higher the implicit price on second-period consumption. And using this budget constraint, we can apply the pre-existing optimal tax results from the Ramsey and Murley's traditions as of that time. The Ramsey story basically being in a three-good model, you have the Hague result from much earlier still, the 1950s, that you basically want to tax the two consumption goods the same unless one of them is more of a complement for leisure, the untaxed good, than the other. Untaxed, I mean, in the sense that one can't tax leisure distinctly from labor. I mean, that is from the labor endowment. And so we had that result, and that was sort of well known at that time. Of course, that means that in terms of the taxation of saving, one would want to tax saving if and only if second-period consumption, retirement consumption, was more of a complement for leisure than first-period consumption. And we didn't necessarily have a lot of information on that at the time, but at least we sort of thought that could be possible. On the other hand, at the same time, we had the earlier than this paper, classic paper by Atkinson Stiglitz, that said that if you had taxes on consumption goods, as well as a progressive lifetime consumption tax, or in this case a labor income tax, then you would only want to have differential taxation of the consumption goods rather than just taxing all consumption through this progressive lifetime consumption or labor income tax. If you didn't have, well, a sufficient condition, I should say, for not having those taxes would be weak separability of the utility function into the consumption goods and leisure. And that's a weaker condition than in the Ramsey case. In a way of thinking about it is you have a more powerful instrument here in terms of the tax on labor income, not just a linear tax, but a arbitrarily progressive one. So that's where we stood as of the Atkinson Sanmo paper. Now, what's missing from that analysis? Well, there's a lot, of course, missing from that analysis, but in terms of the static model itself, that is, not thinking about dynamics in a richer sense, but just thinking about the model as it's written down, one could make things more complicated even there, for example, by adding more periods to the model. In particular, it's a restrictive simplification to assume that there's labor supply only in one period. If you have labor supply in several periods, then the Atkinson-Stiglitz results, for example, about just a progressive labor income tax sufficing, well, that really wouldn't be true anymore. You need to have differential taxation of labor in different periods. You would need to have age-based taxation in order to, unless some much more restrictive assumptions are satisfied, in order to forego consumption taxes or taxes on saving implicitly. And I'll come back and say more about that in terms of talking about what's happened since the Atkinson Sanmo paper. But I think the deeper issues in translating the results on the pre-Atkinson and Sandmo literature have to do with the fact that it doesn't really, even if it captures dynamics in a Arrow-Debreu sense that we can call goods with different indices, goods at different dates or in different states of nature, in reality there's something missing when we do that. One of the things, of course, an important thing is dynamic inconsistency. You can't have dynamic inconsistency in an Arrow-Debreu model because everything is done at once and then it's done. Whereas in the case of truly dynamic models, the government has an opportunity to re-optimize. And if one thinks about classic papers or around this time, like the one by Kidlin and Prescott, in talking about the incentives for government to deviate from previously announced policies, that's a big issue for capital income taxation. There was also a paper by Stan Fisher around the same time analyzing specifically the capital income tax objectives of government. So it's missing. It's missing actually from a lot of the literature, but it is an important issue. Second, lack of complete Arrow-Debreu markets. In particular, the lack of complete ability of individuals to contract overall states of nature. And it gives taxation a potential role in providing insurance. Borrowing and liquidity constraints. So, and this is something I'm also going to come back to, but the timing and other tax characteristics may matter. That is, you can, as I'll talk about, there's a certain equivalence between labor income taxes and consumption taxes. One of the differences between them, though, has to do with timing. That is, they may be equivalent in terms of a lifetime budget constraint, but labor income taxes, of course, are paid earlier in life than consumption taxes are. So to the extent that there may be liquidity constraints, particularly early in life, it could be that consumption taxes might be better simply because they align better with when people have resources available. And these issues, have come up over and over again through the years. Just to give you an illustration, in the U.S. during the recession, one of the things that we were thinking about doing was offering businesses accelerated depreciation allowances. And, in terms of budget constraints, this might have seemed like a kind of a useless thing to do. The interest rate was basically zero at the time. So what good would it do to give a business allow the business to pay its tax a little later by shifting forward its deductions, given that the interest rate was zero? Well, of course, the answer was the interest rate wasn't zero for those that were liquidity constrained or had limited access to capital markets, which was a potentially big problem during that period, at least for companies with less than stellar credit ratings. Another is the coexistence of overlapping generations, which of course is what we're going to be getting into in the Atkinson and Sanmo paper. The budget constraint, where we look at a, not only timeless budget constraint, but when we're looking at a representative individual, can be very informative. But if we're thinking about taxation in the real world where we have overlapping generations, that's a pretty restrictive simplification. Now, in thinking about modeling taxation and overlapping generations models, there are a couple of issues that arise. First of all, going back to Diamond's classic paper in the 60s, there's dynamic efficiency. The fact that when you have a overlapping generations model in which not all generations are trading at the same time, you can get what might otherwise be anomalous outcomes, such as having too much capital which of course can be addressed in the diamond model using debt. And of course, related to the use of debt is intergenerational redistribution and the fact that debt policy is a way of transferring resources among generations. And then there's also the potential for intergenerational linkages via bequests. And of course, in a very simplified model, that can bring you back to an infinite horizon model. But that is certainly not what's done here in this paper. Now, Atkinson and Sanmo focused on the first of these issues. And I should say here, and sort of just in terms of the history of thought, this was not the first paper to look at optimal taxation in overlapping generations models. There were, for example, some nice, although complex papers by Ordover and Phelps just a few years before this, which in fact, in some dimensions went further, taking distributional considerations into account. But this paper, the Atkinson and Sanmo paper, I think is a classic paper because even though it in some sense is a simpler model, it represents the clearest bridge to the Ramsey literature and sort of sees how you get from the Ramsey literature to more complicated questions. So let me now spend a few minutes talking about the setup in the Atkinson and Sanmo paper. It's a two-period OLG model, the standard one with labor and two consumption goods. And there are a lot of potential fiscal instruments, taxes on labor, taxes on capital, that is interest income, taxes on first-period consumption, taxes on second-period consumption, lump sum taxes on the young, lump sum taxes on the old, national debt. It will turn out, of course, that some of these instruments are redundant. That is, once you have a certain set of them, adding additional instruments doesn't do anything for you. This is a model in which we're maximizing a social welfare function, but there's no distributional considerations within cohorts. It's just a representative individual. So it might seem sort of ironic that the same Tony Atkinson that had written the paper with Joe Stiglitz considering sort of consumption taxation in a Murley's model reverted to the older Ramsey tradition in looking at this paper. But I guess you could say that there's something more, there's another dimension that's more complicated in terms of thinking about dynamics. But there is still an equity consideration here, but it's the intergenerational kind, thinking about equity across cohorts rather than within. And there are several results in the paper presented in a very clear way. I mean, it's one of some papers after a few decades you read them and you sort of wish they had written it a different way because things are could be a lot clearer, and that is not the case here. It's a very well-written paper. The first result is that with uniform lump sum taxes, that is the same tax on young and old plus national debt, you can achieve a first best outcome in terms of social welfare maximization. And you can think of this as traditional targeting. In a static model, you'd use lump sum taxes to achieve an efficient outcome because within a cohort you don't have any distributional objectives. And then to deal with intergenerational redistribution, you just you just use national debt to push more liabilities onto the future or more liabilities onto present generations. Now, of course, this nice targeting works in this model because there's two periods. Two instruments, two periods, so in terms of getting efficiency as well as getting the distribution right between the two cohorts, you'd need more instruments if you had more generations. A way of seeing that is an alternative result is you also get a first best if you don't have national debt, but you can vary the taxes and transfers on the two cohorts. Because you can basically have an implicit debt policy by raising taxes on young cohorts and using that, basically making a transfer in the Samuelson, going back to Samuelson's consumption loan model, making a transfer from the young to the old and just continuing to do that in each successive period. It's as if you've created national debt. So you don't need, you can, and of course if you had more generations alive at the same time, you would need lump sum taxes on each in order to accomplish that. Now the equivalent, and as I said, there are some things in the paper that aren't drawn out as clearly as they might be. The equivalence of the tax transfer scheme and debt isn't just, it's not just an accident or a coincidence. It's, you could think of it as simply confirming that through the tax system, tax and transfer system, one can introduce implicit liabilities or assets. And this relates, for example, to the literature initiated by Feldstein earlier in that decade, ending in 1980, where he introduced the concept of Social Security wealth, the idea that governments had an implicit liability to individuals in terms of the promises to pay them Social Security. Those were not explicit government, and still aren't explicit government liabilities, which of course has become a big issue in developed countries over the years, but nevertheless has the same, or at least arguably the same economic effects as explicit national debt would. Now, if we continue to restrict the instruments available to the government, if, for example, you have debt but no lump sum taxation, so now you're, for example, suppose you have labor income taxes and capital income taxes and debt, well, you could still use debt to deal with the intergenerational redistribution issue. So get that out of the way, and now what you're left with is a static optimal tax problem. And so you get the Ramsey/Corlett and Hague results again, even in this more complicated model, because you use debt to basically isolate each generation. Finally, if you have no debt and no lump sum taxation, so you're just using distortionary taxes. For example, and the one they focus on, the case they focus on is just taxes on labor income and capital income. Then you can get, then there's still an equity efficiency trade-off because these are inefficient taxes, but because this is the only instruments you have also to affect the intergenerational distribution of resources, that's going to push you perhaps away from the most efficient outcomes. And indeed, you can get some what appear to be very strange results. And there's one that's particularly strange, I think, is that you can get the result that even if you had the conditions needed for the Corlett and Hague result, that is, suppose you had a labor being equal complement for, each of the consumption goods being an equal complement for leisure, you can nonetheless find that it's optimal to tax capital income, have a positive tax on capital income as a way of transferring resources to future generations. Now that seems, to most of us, that would probably seem backwards. That is, if we're worrying about accumulating resources for the future, we might think we want to subsidize saving. But in this result, and it comes through quite clearly in the theory, you actually want to tax saving. And what's going on here is that the tax on saving isn't being done for efficiency reasons, as in trying to accumulate more capital, but actually having to do with the fact that debt is absent from the model. So with just labor and capital income taxation and no debt, there are for this optimization, two relevant attributes of labor and capital taxes. Of course, there are the behavioral responses, which affect efficiency, but there are also generational effects. In particular, labor income taxes are paid by the young cohort, capital income taxes are paid by the older cohort. So if you're trying to transfer resources from the older cohort to the younger cohort, it would be great if you could use lump sum taxes, and it'd be great if you could use debt, but if neither of those things is available and you've only got a labor income tax and a capital income tax, there's exactly one instrument you can use, and that's the capital income tax. So even if it's more distortionary than labor income taxes, you may nonetheless find yourself using it. Now, it's important to point out, again, as it was not pointed out in the Atkinson Sanmo paper, that this result hinges completely on capital being the only way to tax the old. Because remember, you're using capital for two different things here, and you don't want to tax it for efficiency reasons, but nonetheless you tax it to transfer resources. Well, suppose that you also have consumption taxes, which they have earlier in the paper. And so you could write this augmented budget constraint where you take account not only of taxes on labor and capital income, but taxes on consumption. And of course, we can see by thinking about the equivalences, if we think if tau 1 and tau 2 are equal, then that's going to give you the same budget constraint as taxing labor income at rate t. You just choose the right levels of tau and t, and you're going to get exactly the same budget constraint. So in that sense, these are equivalent. But of course, in this dynamic overlapping generation setting, they're not going to be equivalent. In particular, if we lower the labor income tax, raise the consumption taxes, because you let them be uniform, raise them at the same rate, we may end up with the same budget constraint on every generation that has a full budget constraint, but there's going to be one generation, and namely the initial old generation, that's going to get hit by the consumption tax. And so what we've just succeeded in doing is creating negative debt, that is creating a government asset in the form of the transfer from the old to the young. And so we no longer need to use capital income taxes because we can accomplish it. So if you threw a uniform consumption tax into this model along with a labor income tax and a capital income tax, you'd be back to having, and you had the Corlett-Hay condition satisfied, you'd be back to having capital income tax be zero. That example in itself illustrates that consumption taxes and labor taxes aren't equal, even without bequests or inheritance, because they're implicit liabilities or assets, as one thinks about the comparison of labor income taxes and consumption taxes. Okay, so that's basically the Atkinson and Sanmo paper. Now, there's, of course, been tons of research in the years since then on the effects of taxation on intergenerational distribution, on efficiency, capital income taxation and efficiency, and so forth. So let me just talk about some of these. There's research on timing and intergenerational incidence. Now, there's a greater understanding, certainly I have a greater understanding than I did when I first read the Atkinson and Sanmo paper, of the effects of transitions between tax systems, for example, moving from an income tax to a consumption tax, or thinking alternatively about moving from an income tax to a labor income tax. When Larry Kotlikoff and I were first doing OLG simulation modeling, we found this funny result that for the U.S., sort of roughly calibrated for the U.S., that if you made a cold turkey transition from an income tax to a consumption tax, that would be increasing utility in the steady state. And if you actually went to a labor income tax, you'd be decreasing utility. And that struck us initially as strange, given that we thought basically they have the same effect on the budget constraint. But of course, the example I just showed you tells us that's not true. And here, basically, if you go to a consumption tax relative to going to a labor income tax, there's an implicit capital levy on all the wealth that's previously been accumulated. So in a sense, even though there's no bequest in the model, people are essentially leaving themselves bequests when the new regime starts and pay taxes on consumption from that previously accumulated wealth. There's been a consideration of capital income taxation in multi-period models. The celebrated papers by Chomley and Judd basically showing that you want capital income taxes to go to zero to avoid this increasing intertemporal wedge as the horizon lengthens. So just a note of caution here. From a paper by Straub and Werning just last year, revisiting the Chomley and Judd papers and noting that there were some either implicit assumptions or assumptions that weren't made at all, that are in addition to those that were made in the papers, that are required for those results to hold. Nevertheless, I think the intuition from those papers is helpful. And then also getting back to the point I made earlier about another thing that comes out in multi-generation models, more than two, the use of capital income taxes to substitute for labor income taxation. For efficiency, for example, the intuition is I'd like to tax, say, middle-aged people's labor supply more heavily than young people's. I can't because the tax system, for some reason, for political reasons or whatever, doesn't let me. One way of doing it is to tax the consumption of older people. Well, what makes older people different from younger people? One of the things that makes them different is they have assets. And so if I tax capital income, I'm taxing the future consumption of people who have capital, which is older people. And so that's an indirect and not as good way of taxing labor income at a higher rate. You could also an argument, a paper by Kness et al. In the AER, you might want to use capital income taxes for risk sharing. That is, people have, people are lucky, people are unlucky. They end up with divergent lifetime paths. Again, one of the things that is going to distinguish them is the amount of capital they have, and so taxing capital income is a way of getting at that. Now, I should note here, and this sort of relates back to the Atkinson Sanmo paper, one could also use consumption taxes for insurance. That is, if you want to, particularly if you're just thinking about sort of within lifetime inequality, if you want to hit people who have been successful more than people who have been unsuccessful, you can do it through taxing capital income, but you can probably do it more efficiently through taxing consumption, because the more successful will have higher consumption as well. And there's a paper by a JP paper by Nishiyama and Smetters that points that out. There's work in stochastic environments. Of course, Mike's going to be talking about work in the new dynamic public finance, so I'll just leave it at that. But we've also seen a consideration of the roles that, getting back to the point I made earlier about incomplete markets and capital taxation as insurance, the role that other capital taxes, other taxes may play in insuring investment risks. The basic intuition is, going back to Domar and Musgrave, is that capital income doesn't just reduce the mean of return to assets, it reduces the variance. Now, since then, there have been some papers sort of pointing out that you can think about the returns to capital as having components: the safe return, the excess return to risk taking, and the perhaps rents or other components of what we call returns to capital. And in a couple of papers by Roger Gordon and Louis Kaplow, it was shown that in general equilibrium, if you have efficient capital markets, then taxing excess returns basically has no effect. It's a neutral tax, because you're basically taking excess returns that have no value to people and filtering, recirculating them in the economy, and nothing happens. More generally, there's an important related result, which is even if there isn't complete risk sharing, even if you have rents there, it's still the case that the difference between a consumption tax and a capital income tax in terms of its effect on capital income is only through its effect on the safe rate of return. That is, capital income hits all the components of the return to capital. Consumption taxes hit rents, provide risk sharing, but don't hit the safe return to capital. And therefore, if you can come up with a way of exempting the safe rate of return to capital, either by giving people a certain rate of return without taxing them, or by having a system like the ACE system for the allowance for corporate equity, or something that just sort of gives a normal rate of return, a low normal rate of return, tax-free before taxing returns, you've basically gotten to a consumption tax. So just a few final comments in terms of the future. In particular, two issues that I think are unresolved but interesting to think about. One is the optimal mix of lifetime capital income taxes and wealth transfer. In the U.S., the estate tax, here the inheritance tax, although I should say that in the U.S. politically it's now universally called the death tax by its opponents. Now there's a active recent literature on optimal estate taxes. Two papers I mentioned here are by Fari and Werning, and also by Piketty and Sias. In both cases, and there are other papers in the literature, but in a general characteristic of this literature is it's focusing primarily on intergenerational issues. So thinking about the intergenerational transmission of wealth, persistence of inequality, the externalities of the bequest externality, and the fact that you might even want to subsidize bequests. But all of this has to do with sort of the linkage between generations and how estate or inheritance taxes influence behavior, bequest behavior. Not really thinking about the within cohort distortions associated with estate taxes, because estate taxes, at least to some extent, discourage lifetime saving. Even if you're saving for a bequest, it's as if you're you're being taxed on that by an estate tax. You're also being taxed on that through lifetime capital income taxes. Of course, there are differences, you know, to the extent that estate incentive, motivations or to leave estates may be different. There may also be accidental bequests, so it's not perfectly analogous. And of course, you have lifetime saving for other purposes than leaving an estate. Now, if wealth transfer taxes are effective, and if you, I mean, this is, I wouldn't say this is a theorem, but I would propose it as one. That is, it's not a theorem in the literature, but I would propose it as one. If wealth transfer taxes are effective, there's no obvious role for lifetime capital income taxes if we have consumption taxes present. That is, there are reasons why you want to have taxes on the results of wealth accumulation beyond estate taxes if, say, there's lifetime risk. But you can take care of those with consumption taxes without having the within lifetime distortion of the saving decision. So it's not obvious why, if you had a wealth transfer tax and you have consumption taxes, labor income taxes, you can set them in progressive ways, why you would also want to have capital income taxes. Now, if you ruled out consumption taxes, you might then want to have capital income taxes, although I would just say, particularly because annual wealth taxes have recently become popular again, at least in theory, that you wouldn't use annual wealth taxes, you'd use capital income taxes, because the argument that taxes can be used to insure risks applies to taxes that apply to ex post returns. That could be consumption taxes, could be capital income taxes. It would not be wealth taxes, because wealth taxes are equivalent to taxes on the safe rate of return to capital and don't touch the excess return to risk taking. But what if wealth transfer taxes aren't particularly efficient in terms of their administration and enforcement, as may very well be the case? That is, we think of the estate and inheritance taxes as taxes that are relatively difficult to administer, provide lots of avoidance opportunities that are at least appear to be difficult to stamp out. Well, then you might want an integrated system of lifetime and annual wealth taxes. Not necessarily they would apply at all ages, but you could certainly imagine if it's hard to tax estates efficiently or effectively because of administrative costs, then maybe taxing wealth among the elderly would be a way of at least, or integrating taxes and wealth on wealth among the elderly with estate taxes might be a way of doing better. The UK, I think, already has sort of a system like that because it taxes gifts in anticipation of death as if they were made at death, which you can think of as a partial wealth tax that applies earlier. And of course, we have partial wealth taxes in the form of property taxes, but nothing like I'm thinking about here. The other thing I think is interesting to think about for the future is the optimal taxation of retirement saving. So, of course, in the Atkinson Sanmo model, that's what saving is done for. It's done for retirement. Now, most developed countries have separate treatment of retirement saving, and typically much more favorable treatment of retirement saving. So the idea that saving is saving, capital income should be taxed at the same rate for a given individual really doesn't apply. And there are different reasons for why that might be true. It could be, even in the standard model, you might simply say, well, I want to have capital income taxes, but I don't want the capital income taxes following the Chomley-Judd logic. I don't want them to just keep increasing distortions over time, so I eventually want the capital income taxes to subside. And the way I can do that is by treating most saving as not tax favored, for shorter horizons, but for saving that occurs for very long horizons, I might want to have a lower tax. But we have all kinds of other provisions affecting retirement saving that aren't consistent with the standard model. Contribution ceilings, withdrawal restrictions, things that an optimizing agent would suffer from and we wouldn't want to impose. But of course, we have all kinds of things in our fiscal system, such as mandatory public pensions, that don't make sense if we think of think of rational agents as the only people who inhabit the world. So you need an explanation like optimization failures, and that's not really a very controversial point. But in this context, what should tax rules look like? There's been a lot of work in the literature in recent years about optimal regulation, such as what defaults and nudges, what defaults should be, making requirements for individuals to participate in plans and so forth. But we don't know what role the tax, if any, we haven't really determined what role the tax system should play in this, whether there's a complementarity between tax rules and regulations here, whether tax rules are simply superfluous. So that brings me to my final slide, which is just to reiterate what I said at the beginning of my talk. The Atkinson Sanmo paper is it's aged well. It's hard to go back and read a paper from one goes back and reads a paper from 1980, even one's own paper, with some trepidation, because of course you certainly hope that there's nothing that's just wrong, which alas happens sometimes. But even if everything is right, you may say, gee, that's sort of obvious, or why did they say it that way? And there's very little of that in reading this paper. And so, again, it was a pleasure reading this and realizing, as I did, the extent to which this paper represented a bridge from static to dynamic analysis of taxation of saving. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. We'll move straight over to the camera.
Should I use this? Yeah. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for putting this session together. It's a great pleasure to be in Manchester and to discuss this paper. So Atkinson Sanmo, it is, I agree with Alan, that's one of this classic contribution of theory of taxation of savings. And the paper does a systematic analysis of capital taxation and life cycle economy and point out the key forces which determine whether the taxation is optimal or not, and how you want to use it. And emphasizes how different assumptions about both the policy instruments available to the government and the parameters of the key elasticities affect both desirability and the sign of different taxes. So this is an important paper. It's still being widely taught in graduate programs. And it is a starting point for much of the recent work in optimal taxation. So what I want to do in my discussion is kind of give a brief overview of that recent work and discuss its connection to Atkinson and Sanmo's work. So Alan already overviewed the main assumptions of Atkinson and Sanmo, basically a representative agent within a cohort who lives for 2 periods, work, consumes, saves in period 1, retires in period 2. The government can use some combination of taxes on consumption, labor, savings, and poll taxes in its policy. And the analysis kind of focuses, like one of the key parts of the analysis is discussion how availability of poll taxes and debt affects the optimal savings behavior, the optimal taxes on savings for the government. Now, so when Atkinson and Sanmo were writing their model, they kind of were up against an important constraint. On the one hand, to achieve analytical tractability, they had to make the model as simple as possible. I think that was part of the reason for the assumptions behind it. But the more simple you make the model, the harder it is to map into the data, into the policy instruments. What do the poll taxes in the model correspond to the data with a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of different welfare programs, and so on and so forth. How to map some of the key elasticities, again, from what we can estimate into the data into two-period model. So that was kind of a problem. Since 1980, there was a lot of both methodological and technological advances in economics. On the theoretical part, now we just have simply better theoretical tools to solve the problems which Atkinson, Sandmo, Merlis, Diamond were trying to solve in the 70s and 80s. So now we can have much more realistic environments where we can get analytical results just kind of with these better tools. We have better empirical techniques and better data sets to be able to pin down the key parameters which kind of affect the sign and the magnitude of the optimal taxes. We have better computers which simplify our life all around. And so now the optimal tax literature is kind of at the point where it can take off-the-shelf, state-of-the-art empirical labor literature, and not that different from what Richard, for example, will estimate in his work, and conduct normative analysis about design of optimal taxes and transfers. And so what I'll do here, I'll take effectively Atkinson and Sanmo model, extend it in many directions simultaneously, kind of to make it more realistic. There will be more periods, there will be uncertainty. One of the main extensions will be allowing heterogeneity within a cohort. Atkinson and Sanmo seem to agree in their paper with that direction just as much. Extending into the dimension of heterogeneity is important. Extending by allowing heterogeneity is important for at least two reasons. One, a lot of things which governments do these days is really redistributing resources from one group of households to the other. And moreover, having heterogeneity and underlying theory how the government sets taxes in the presence of this heterogeneity, in the presence of the fact that some households will not be able to pay the poll taxes, the government cares about the poor, also will have the implications for the tax instruments that the government employs. And so Atkinson and Stiglitz Atkinson and Sandmo suggested, to incorporate the work of Merlis into their analysis, and that's exactly what I'll do. In this paper, most of the time I'll focus on the paper which I wrote with Troshkin and Savinsky, but some of the results and some of the insights will go back both to my earlier work of Farrier and Werning, as well as the work by Merlis, Piketty, Diamond, and Sayers, kind of thinking about the static environments. So in my model, there will be T+1. It will be basically a model of one cohort. There will be T+1 periods. Period 0 will correspond to a static model. Preferences will be over consumption C and leisure or effort L. Beta is a discount factor. In period 0, each individual draws a type theta from some distribution F0. And after that, types follow some stochastic process over time. At this stage, it will be a quite general process, F, with the only assumption that it's a Markov process. Little f will denote the PDF of big F, and theta superscript t will denote the history of shocks that you experienced up to period t. Agents, everybody knows the stochastic process from which shocks are being drawn. Agents learn the realization of theta in period t, but not before. This will be a very kind of straightforward generalization of Merlis into dynamic environments. So type theta, if supplies L units of effort, produces theta times L units of output. I assume that effort and skill is unobservable, everything else is. In terms of designing of optimal taxes and transfers, that will imply that the government cannot make taxes to depend on realization of theta and effort, everything else can. It's also possible to transfer resources between periods with an exogenous rate of return 1 over delta. In fact, for this talk, I will assume that delta is equal to beta, and these things will disappear in most of the formulas. And S will denote savings. Now I have economy where individuals are ex ante heterogeneous. So to think about welfare, there will be a vector of Pareto weights alpha, which measure how much the government cares about redistribution. So before I go further, one comment. So in this model, as I set it up, it's a partial equilibrium. There is no explicit OLG structure. On some level, that's not a very binding assumption. As you will see shortly, in this model, a lot of intergenerational redistribution can be achieved by changing the timing of transfers that you give to different agents. And you can achieve a lot of things which Atkinson and Sandmo were achieving with poll taxes in the first part of their paper. Effectively, you can do it here with using transfers. So I'll start first with the static model. It will not have savings, but it will be the easiest way to kind of describe connection between theory and the data. And once we understand how the static model works, dynamic extension will be kind of straightforward generalization of that. So in the static model, there is no capital. The government can only tax labor, income, and consumption. In this model, it will be equivalent to which one you tax. So I'll pick taxes on Y, on income. And so the question is how the government chooses the optimal tax to maximize social welfare, utilities of agents weighted with Pareto weights alpha. Now, there are two equivalent ways of thinking about this problem. One way is to try to optimize with respect to the tax function T of Y directly. It's not a very easy problem because at this stage T of Y is an arbitrary nonlinear function, but it can be done. Piketty had an early paper where he worked out a simple example, and then Sayers in his job market paper generalized it for a very large class of environments in static settings. Alternatively, you can do an indirect way when you evoke a revelation principle and set up a mechanism design problem where agents send reports about their types to a fictitious social planner, and the social planner allocates consumption and labor supply decisions to all the agents subject to the incentive compatibility constraint. No agent has incentives to mislead the planner about his realization. You can solve that mechanism design problem, find those constraint optimal allocations, and then back out what tax function T of Y should be to implement those allocations. The important thing to keep in mind, these two approaches, those are approaches which solve exactly the same problem. It emphasizes exactly the same forces and produce exactly the same results. The mechanism design approach is much simpler to use. That's why it was developed 30 years before. But it's also less intuitive. Once you kind of solve it using Sayers method, you get the formulas which has a lot of intuitive appeal. But essentially, that's exactly the same problem. And so when you're solving this problem, we'll focus on marginal taxes, which is a wedge between marginal utility of consumption and marginal disutility of labor. And then if you want to go from the marginals to the average, you can either compute Y minus C or just integrate this tax function. One important thing which I want to spend a little bit of time is to talk about connection between taxes in the theoretical model and the taxes in practice. In the model, T of Y is the sum of all the taxes and transfers that individuals receive. So if you want to say, find an empirical counterpart of marginal taxes in the model, we need to find the effective marginal tax rate, which is the sum of, loosely speaking, of a statutory tax rate and the rate at which transfers are being phased out in your labor. Transfers and their phase-outs, they play a very important role. Even in the US, which is relatively skimpy in terms of welfare programs, transfers are kind of a big deal, especially in the left tail of the household. So this picture, which I think Richard pointed, so that shows this is household earnings, household living in Colorado with 2 children, their pre-tax earnings, and the value of different transfer programs that they receive. There are a lot of different transfer programs. You can read them here. And as the general pattern, as your income becomes larger and larger, you start losing eligibility for those transfer programs. So if you want to find the effective marginal tax rate, you need to take the derivative, the slope of these transfer programs, and sum it up with the statutory tax rate. Once you do it, you'll see that in Colorado, a household with 2 children faces this schedule of marginal taxes. They're very large and negative for very low income, rapidly rising, and reach very high levels around $35,000 a year. After that, they kind of U-shape, they fall, and then they increase again. So in general, in the data, taxes are very nonlinear. In the US, they vary with your income, but also with the state you live, with family characteristics, and maybe progressive, maybe U-shape, maybe what they call it inverted U-shape, may take other forms, which my English is just not good enough to describe. In Atkinson and Sandmo, poll taxes, the assumption whether the government can or cannot use poll taxes played an important role. What's so important is in the representative agent model, poll tax is basically a lump sum tax, which is always negative. It's always a good thing to have. In these models, but what is important for the result is not whether those poll taxes are negative or not, but whether the government can vary them across different cohorts or across different agents. The empirical counterpart of poll taxes in this context would be transfers at 0 income. And those transfers are large, they're widely used. They vary in general with age, past income, assets, family structure. So here I gave some examples of abbreviations of various welfare programs used in the US. So now I will not talk about the results in the static model. Some of them kind of will come again, will re-emerge once I go to the dynamic setting. So in a dynamic model, again, we can characterize the optimal taxes one of the 2 ways, the same as in the static model. We can either try to analyze taxes directly. It's even harder than in the static model because dynamic and stochastic nature introduces additional complications, but it can be done. Or we can, again, invoke the revelation principle, solve the mechanism design problem, find the constraint optimal, and then back out taxes directly. So this is where theoretical advances actually theoretical advances in the literature play a big role. 25 years ago, this approach was also hard because if you try to solve the mechanism design problem directly, head-on, it becomes very difficult. But then in the late 80s and early 90s, mechanism design literature developed these recursive contracting tools, which basically collapses dynamic stochastic problems into a two-period, something which looks very similar to a 2 or 3 goods model, which is not that different from what Mirrlees was solving in mid-70s. And those are the advances that will use. And so I'll be showing you some results about labor distortions, which in dynamic model will begin the wedge between marginal utility of effort and marginal utility of consumption. And savings distortions which will be the wedge in the consumer early equation. So I'll focus on the distortions rather than on taxes because just like in the static model, the same allocations can be implemented with many different types of taxes. So there is a big set of optimal taxes. The optimal allocations and the optimal distortions are typically unique. Also, these are the optimal taxes of type theta t who has shocked theta t today and had a past history of shocks theta t minus 1. So in principle, all these distortions and all these taxes are very history dependent. Now, it's useful to focus on this rich setup for 2 reasons. One, even if you're interested in much simpler programs, this can be an important finding. The constraint optimal can be a useful guide to think about which features are important for simpler programs. And in many environments, you actually don't need a lot of that history dependence. For example, in some environments, simpler taxes, which is just a joint tax on labor and capital income, does a lot of the job. Basically, with the basic insight that already the ability to tax capital captures a lot of history dependence in the life cycle model. So for this talk, For that, I'll show you. I'll introduce two additional assumptions, which not really necessary for general theory. One, I'll focus on this quasi-linear, on this separable isoelastic preferences. I do it basically to avoid some caveats and to streamline my discussion. Once you allow, say, non-separability, there will be additional insights related to the fact that whether consumption and leisure are complements. You may want to. There might be additional reasons to tax settings. The second assumption that the shock process will take the following form. So log theta t will have some age-dependent trend or gas profile. So AT may change over time. We'll have persistence rho. And epsilon is a mean zero shock drawn from a family which consists of three distributions: log normal, mixture of log normals, operator log normals. In principle, rho can depend on t. In principle, parameters within this process can also depend on the past realization of shocks. This, to me, seems pretty innocuous assumption as far as I know. Pretty much all the empirical labor literature uses stochastic processes which fall into this category. So what insights come out of the analysis of that problem? So first, let me start with savings distortion. So the general result in this literature is that as long as preferences are separable, the optimal allocation satisfies what is known as the inverse Euler equation. 1 over marginal utility of consumption is equal to beta r, which here under my assumptions is equal to 1, expectation of your tomorrow's 1 over marginal utility of consumption. Now, what does this equation say? Well, if there is any uncertainty in the future, well, if there is no uncertainty, then this equation collapses just to the regular Euler equation. So if there is no uncertainty, there is no savings distortion. If there is any uncertainty, then by Jensen's inequality, we can rewrite this expression in this form and see that the optimal savings distortion is positive. So this says that as long as there is any uncertainty, this says two things. Savings distortion, it's optimal in this model to distort savings. And the reason why it's optimal to distort savings is because of idiosyncratic shocks. How big those shocks are will have a big implication of how big savings distortion should be. Before I show simulations, you can also get some of the back envelope ideas or estimates of those distortions. So you can take we can take this expression. If, say, we take something like log preferences, UC is just equal to 1 over C. And then we write that the savings distortion is equal to 1 minus 1 over expectation of consumption growth rate. Two things true about this. One, if you want to get general qualitative properties, over time, the closer individual to retirement, the less shocks are to their present value of earnings, the less volatile their consumption growth rates will be. So their optimal savings distortion should be lower. Also, if you're a low-income household, you get a lot of transfers, at least in the optimum. So transfers will provide you a lot of insurance against your shocks. So again, those households will face lower savings distortion. Also, you can estimate consumption growth process in the data, plug it into this equation, and get at least to get a sense of the orders of magnitude for savings distortions. Keep in mind that this is savings distortion on as the way I define it, this is the savings distortion on the gross asset return, which is interest rate return plus principal. Now, turn to labor distortions. How much time do I have? Turn to labor distortions. So the labor distortion in period t for somebody who has shock theta today in period t is the sum of this kind of big uglyish expression, which is the sum of two terms. The first term, for those who work familiar with the static Merlis model and that literature, at least qualitatively, you'll recognize it's exactly the same term which appears in Merlis, Diamond, Sias, and so on. So this term comes from the fact that in this model, there are basically two things that the government wants to do. It wants to provide insurance against new shocks that you receive in period T, and also wants to provide the redistribution and some dynamic incentives to insure against the previous period shock. So the first term comes from the what they call intertemporal component. The need to provide insurance against the new shocks drawn in period T. So all these are conditional hazard ratios from the conditional stochastic process of shocks. Conditional who you were yesterday, these are the probability that you are any given type today. The second term, which consists of the persistence of the stochastic process, labor distortions you faced before, and consumption growth rate, captures the need to provide incentives dynamically. Because there are two forces, and generally those two forces will push in different directions, the shape and the size of the optimal distortions will depend on the combination of the two forces. Some insights I can take by taking limits either for very high, if you're very lucky, as theta goes to infinity, or very unlucky, as theta goes to 0. Turns out that for high realization of shocks, if you're very lucky, then distortions in the limit are driven purely by intertemporal component. A lot of insights that Mirlis and Simons and Diamond kind of point out, they also will be true here. For low realization of shocks, the opposite, distortions will be driven purely by the intertemporal component. So if I take the limits, say, for very good shocks, I can derive the law of motion for marginal labor distortions. So here they are. I'll point out to the kind of the most important insights. So labor distortions depend only on the elasticity of labor supply for very high realizations of shocks, on the elasticity of labor supply, some summary statistics of the conditional hazard ratio in the right tail, which is variance kurtosis of the thickness of the tail, depending whether you pick log normal, mixture of log normals or Pareto log normal distribution, and the income effect. It does not depend on the redistributive objectives on the Pareto weights. It does not depend on any past history of shocks. It does not depend on low moments, first moments of the stochastic process, things like persistence of the trend. And so in general, they're the same for all agents. On the other hand, if I look for the labor distortions in the left tail as theta goes to 0, those labor distortions depend on the persistence. The higher persistence, the higher distortions will be. Distortions from previous periods, which will also incorporate redistributor objectives and Pareto weights. Typically, the more redistributor the government is, the higher tax transfers it wants to give to the agents. But that also will mean that the faster it will need to phase them out, so the higher distortions in the left tail will be. And the consumption growth rate. Now, consumption growth rate, again, the closer you are to retirement, the less volatile your consumption is, the less it falls if you get low income. So that will imply, in general, that there will be higher labor distortions with age. One way to think about it, over time in this economy, individuals accumulate more and more shocks. So the distribution of wealth and kind of implicit outcomes increases over time. That requires more and more insurance from the government. So hence it requires higher distortions. Okay. So now I'm moving towards showing simulations from this economy. My goal is to have parameterization which maybe will not be totally up to standards of the empirical labor literature, but at least something which people like Richard would take reasonably seriously. So I'll take, for preferences, I take log preferences with Frisch elasticity of 0.5. These particular parameters are not super important, at least within the range typically used in the literature. What is very important is the stochastic process for skills. You already have seen that savings distortions principally depends on how big those shocks are. Now, the difficulty here is that how much insurance we need depends not so much on things like variance of shocks, but more on the higher moments. How likely are you to get a reasonably bad or reasonably good outcome? Until recently, we only had data sets like PSID, which just not good enough to estimate those higher moments that well. But in the last 10 years or so, more and more governments started to make their administrative data available to researchers. And so Fatih Guvenin, with several co-authors, used US Social Security administrative data on a data set of 10% working males in the US to estimate stochastic process for earnings, which is which is y in the equivalent of y. So things that they found, well, some which we knew already, shocks are quite persistent in the data. So they estimate it's approximately 1. What they also found is that log normal distribution of shocks is not a very good approximation of what of labor earnings. In particular, they found that those shocks are negatively skewed and highly kurtosis is high. Depending whether you look at 25 to 65s or 35 to 55-year-olds, the kurtosis would be between 12 and 20, while with normal distribution it's 3. And Guvenin suggested that a mixture of log normal distributions capture this shock process much better. So what we did in the data, we did a couple of different ways. One, we just did a quick and dirty way where we took their parameters for earnings and assumed that that's stochastic process for theta that follows. And then we did something much more involved where we used Taxation to estimate the effective marginal taxes. And then we estimated the probability which theta, stochastic process that theta should follow, so that households which face US tax code produce labor earnings which follow the same process. In the end of the day, you also get, no matter which way you do it, you get that those thetas will be also highly leptocortic. Okay, so I'll show you the outcome of solving for the optimal labor distortions. Let me walk you through this graph. So on the y-axis will be how much your annual earnings in any given period t. So this is $100,000, $200,000. So let's take this line. So these are capital distortions for somebody who in the past was making $50,000. So at age 25, you're making $25,000. And this is your savings distortions as a function of what you will be making at age 26. So capital distortions is roughly progressive. You get high, if you make high income, you'll pay higher taxes. And so this is, the first line is somebody who was early in life, 25-year-old. This is somebody who is in the middle life, 45-year-old. So who had a history for 20 years was making $50,000. The last line is somebody who all his life until the last period has been making $50,000, how his savings distortions look like as a function of income realization in the last period. So those savings distortions decrease with age. That's already, I gave the intuitive explanation for that. This is in simulation. These are the magnitude of distortions on the gross capital income. If you want to get the optimal tax on the net, you should multiply it by 30 or 40. So those capital distortions are quite high. Labor distortions, the exact analog of that picture, they're also quite high. They're increasing with age in the left tail. They don't depend on your past history in the right tail. That already was coming from the theoretical work, and they're roughly U-shaped. The bottom panel does the same exercise, but rather than looking at somebody who had history of making $50,000, is somebody who is having a history of making $100,000. You basically have the same qualitative and quantitative patterns, except distortions are shifted a little bit to the right. So this suggests Do you have the slide? This suggests that a progressive, a capital distortion, which is progressive in labor income, and labor distortions, which will kind of come from a combination of progressive statutory taxes, which don't depend on anything rather than your income today, and transfers, which is a function of your past history, which are being phased out relatively quickly on your income, should be a good approximation to the constraint optimal policies. And this analysis, and the reason why I emphasized higher moments and kurtosis, high kurtosis, which was found in the data and hence was put into our model, plays a very important role. Because of high kurtosis, you get these qualitative shapes, and it also implies that there are high gains from using nonlinear history-dependent transfers relative to a simple affine taxes, which will consist of a lump sum transfer and a proportional tax. If I only focus on the first and second moment on mean and variance of shocks, so here I computed again the same model. So these lines are the same lines you saw in the graph before. The blue lines are the lines, the optimal distortions in the model with exactly the same variance and mean, but shocks have been drawn from log normal distribution. You get very different pattern, at least for labor distortion. They're mildly progressive and much lower. This is, in some sense, this is a dynamic generalization of what Mirlis found back in his original paper in '71 when he did all this hard work of computing the optimal, of developing the whole theory of optimal nonlinear taxation, and then solve the model, static model with log normal shocks, and got something which looked pretty close to linear. So higher moments here play an important role. So what I've done, these are my concluding slides. So what I've done, kind of show, I guess, a glimpse of the recent work on optimal taxation, which tries to extend the theoretical insight, going all the way back to Atkinson Sanmo and even earlier work, and combine them with the modern empirical labor literatures of life cycle behavior of households. And now the theoretical work is kind of at the stage when it can take a state-of-the-art estimates from labor literature, pick your kind of favorite labor economist here, and study the design of social insurance programs. Some directions which I emphasize in the labor literature, which I haven't seen studied much, and seem like the natural next steps, is to think about how taxation interacts with family labor supply decisions, extensive labor supply decisions, fertility choices, and so on. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the allocations, the optimal taxes I showed you, they're constrained optimal in the sense that everything depends on the whole history of past shocks. If you want to design simpler system, which would have a couple of features, it would be interesting to explore which of those features would capture most of the gains that come from this nonlinearity and history dependence. Taxation of capital. Here I allowed the government faces no constraints in setting very different rates on taxation on labor and taxation of capital. One concern which people often have is that maybe in practice it's possible to reclassify your labor and capital income one and to the other depending on capital treatment. For many people it probably doesn't matter. I cannot see how I can reclassify my Princeton income as capital income, but for entrepreneurs and Bill Gates of this world, that's the problem. In principle, this is an empirical question. And again, given the amazing data we have now, in Scandinavia, it seems like we have data set on everything that each individual does. it seems to be possible empirically to estimate to what extent that's an issue. And if it is, we can incorporate that into the models.
Thanks very much. That's incredible, fantastic. I'm so pleased that we put this session together. And I think Mike and I will be happy because we can take our models to the data. No, I mean that seriously. I did do a few slides, but I'm tempted almost not to. I just put them up as I knew Tony couldn't be here, and that's. But Alan is. Yeah, that'll do. It's just simple. Okay. Oh, go away. Oh no. Alan said, "Don't use PowerPoint because." I never do. But anyway, yeah. And in fact, I said on Friday, I think in the department, we sat around and talked about the papers a little bit. So I got some ideas from colleagues. And there was a lot more detail here, actually. It was a lot of fun. Generally, as you said, the Atkinson Sanmo paper ages very well. It's a great read, and I hope people... I'm certainly going to get my grad students to look at this streaming of this session. I mean, what's nice about Alan's paper is just the way he sets up the, the key underpinning of the Atkinson Sanmo paper and how overlapping generations economy achieves this, what we call, I guess, the modified golden rule. And that's pretty neat, actually. And I think what's kind of neat that Alan makes the additional point that, without public debt, you can use consumption taxes in intertemporal redistribution. In fact, the paper I looked at of Mike's is the paper he referred to, 2014. And I should have also looked at this latest work. And I'm certainly not going to be tough on Mike because it's his birthday today. And so, so happy birthday. It's a really impressive piece of work. And the analysis in the 2014 paper is really pretty impressive and insightful. It kind of uses the variational perturbation approach to get a set of dynamic public finance, deal with a set of public finance issues. You get the kind of formula he was laying out, which are familiar to us who followed the kind of Diamond Piketty Sayers route, but it's it's incredibly it's quite a big step further. You already saw if even in the static case you dropped out the little income effect, for example, that was always missing in Sayers. Maybe that's easy, but in each case, I recommend reading the paper because in each case you can really learn a lot. Just on the just general topics that people raised that are worth thinking about anyway, one thing that comes up is that, of course, if you set out the political economy environment for these more complex taxes, you can get all kinds of coalitions arising. And it seemed to me that that's worth, as I was discussing it with people, seemed increasingly a kind of important issue left to one side here. And it might be quite an important reason why you have this relatively restrictive set of allowable tax instruments. And in the end, that becomes very important in Mikhail's work because in that kind of work, as we saw at the end, like the Albanese and Sleep paper, you set up a very simple function there. The variational method, it's very nice, essentially building on Diamond Sayers. I guess that's what we call it. You can either look at tax reforms or optimal taxes. You look at you perturb the tax function essentially and check it goes down. So you've got an optimum. And but I guess what struck me at that point was the trade-off with what I would normally do here, and that's the kind of brute force. In fact, what you were really doing at the end of your talk, and that is using kind of simulation and a model like the one Mike presented, for example, and that I've used before. And typically, I mean, there's a kind of interesting debate about how we compare them. I think over coffee we said these are complementary procedures, and I think that's dead right. It's very difficult to, looking at the sufficient statistics, to ever kind of figure out exactly how they relate to a particular model as we would typically estimate them. And, but of course you get the intuition from them. And I think that's becoming quite an important debate, whether we kind of use the kind of structural models from panel data, for example, versus just plugging in methods, plugging in estimates. And I guess one key point is that if you're looking at small perturbations, if you want to look at a kind of redesign, you want to make a discrete step away, and any elasticity you might have estimated would be local to where you were. And it's very difficult to do that. Of course, if you assume constant elasticities, then you're home and dry. But that is something we don't want to assume, or if you're Mike, you find they're not constant anyway, even though underlying parameters are constant. So that would be good. Then there's time consistency. That seemed to come up over and over again as people discuss the problems that really Alan was discussing earlier, and just thinking about things like, moves from EET to TEE, things that we think are neutral. And of course, they're neutral to us, but of course, they're not neutral to governments because they're, EET gets like the 401, the Roth kind of move from 401k to Roth 401k. In fact, the timing of the tax receipts is quite different. And then you think about, well, is this time, is it really credible across time? You see this voted in at this point, but is it going to be credible down the road? And I thought that's a key issue. And then really this is the point you raised, you made earlier. But whether you can really use these, deficit stroke, this general idea of generational counting through government debt, thinking of separating the intergenerational thing from the kind of static efficiency problem. It just seemed to me, as more I thought about it, it's just in practice that's a really tricky thing to do. And I thought of property taxes in the UK. We'd like to raise those. They hit the older generation. Of course, we can easily increase the deficit, maybe by being more generous with pensions at the moment. But how do we really think that kind of idea works? And that's kind of implicit, I think. I get the impression in the Atkinson Sanmo model. And there's a few things here that are really more closer to my heart, and that's really a little bit like, of course, Atkinson-Stiglitz doesn't really have uncertainty or idiosyncratic shocks. That's exactly what Mike's bringing in with his work and other in the dynamic public finance. But I think as soon as, although we're getting these models working now, of course, we're now worrying more about what the underlying earnings process is. And there's more dynamics going on now. You saw, as I put in point 3, if you worry about human capital accumulation on the job, you're going to get a very different process. And so one question, in fact, I've been working with Andrew Shepard on exactly that model, how it changes the kind of results that you put up once you have a human capital model of the kind Mike Keane has been pushing quite importantly. But just generally, how we think about what accounts for existing wealth in this whole discussion, I think, is quite important. It's really, as you said, it's the kind of extraordinary earnings that are driving lots of these recent papers. And are they effort, innovation, pure rents, luck? That's very important here. And particularly, and Mikhail made this very clear at the end, that we find persistence at the top of the distribution is very different and quite asymmetric, as well as being dichotic. So how should we deal with this? And of course, where is it in the Atkinson Sanmo? Well, of course, it's not there because there's no uncertainty, so they didn't have to worry about that at all. But that seems pretty key. And I think that's the way I really like this last slide you were putting up, where you were bringing in these kind of processes that we see. There seems to be, and this is more in the formulation, there's a key role for the intertemporal elasticity. As we know, with saving, taxation of savings and the way, there's almost a knife-edge result of where the intertemporal elasticity is. And I got the impression that you were getting similar things, and that it places a lot of weight on our estimates of that intertemporal parameter. And at one point in your paper, you have a kind of 2/3 point, which strikes me as very worrying, because that's just about what we often find the intertemporal elasticity to be, and that's pretty key. But I guess it's obvious from thinking about Alan's paper that, you know, capital tax changes the taxation on future consumption, and then there's the insurance motive, so you're always going to have this play-off between what the intertemporal elasticity is, which is going to drive the distortion, versus the process of the shocks, which drives the insurance component. And I think actually drawing that out a bit more would be quite nice, because thinking about how the variance of the shocks is the uncertainty part, and then the distortion being the substitution. It's kind of obvious, but until I read your paper, I hadn't really thought about it that way. And then there's a couple of small points that the value of land is a key component of wealth, and the way shocks to the value of land are occurring are clearly quite different to the way we think earnings processes, and yet when we're thinking of capital taxation, at least, that's important. But I think, you know, that's heavily uninvestigated. And in thinking of the work I've been looking at with Agnar, you know, exactly what's driving top wealth and top incomes, property is clearly a key one, and very unrelated to the standard models we have. Then finally, two of my colleagues, Eric French and Christina, have documented a lot of the saving at older ages about these high medical risks at older ages, and that's kind of dominating the way the wealth distribution evolves, and seems to have huge impact on the tax sensitivity of savings, and indeed the tax elasticities. And of course you get this bifurcation of some people thinking they're going to have to pay a lot, and others completely insured. And I haven't thought about this at all, but it seemed like that could be a key aspect in thinking of these models. But that's just a few thoughts, of course. These are great papers. And maybe we've got time for collecting one or two other quick comments, and then I'll let the authors, presenters, both have a response.
Yeah, I'm only an outsider here, but I'm surprised not to hear anything at all about competition, tax competition, so the constraints that this poses. You mentioned political economy, but because it has a hard time trying to tax the rich French. Yeah,
that's true. They're all in London, so we don't bother taxing them very much.
So is this like a well-understood issue?
No, I mean, okay, sorry. I should let's let Alan and Mikhail come back to that. Other comments? Quick comments? Other things people want to raise? I realise it's late in the day. Yeah, we should. So let me let Mikhail and Alan respond. I don't know whether there's anything I've raised they want to respond to, but also to.
Let me just thank Richard for his comments on my paper and Mike's. They were very insightful. The tax competition, you might say everything we do when talking about the taxation of saving is a sideshow and perhaps largely irrelevant, because the international tax competition is rapidly driving the taxation of mobile income from mobile capital to zero. And that does, I mean, I would say that suggests that thinking about consumption tax as an alternative, it makes it even more attractive, to the extent that people's capital may be elsewhere, but their food is where they live, and the other things they buy. That's not completely true either, but I do think that the international tax competition, particularly when you're thinking about the taxation of capital, is a very important component that we need to include in our models more frequently.
It's your birthday. You don't know how you do what you like.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with Alan. I think. I think it is an important issue, and I think, but again, I think we also want to understand better who is affected by tax competition. Like, again, which part of the distribution. Capital tax in the model I present plays two roles. One is you want to redistribute, from households with more wealth to households with less. Another, it provides insurance against idiosyncratic shocks, and by big role of that. And to the extent you think that getting insurance to the households in the left tail of the distribution is relatively more important, because the consumption will fluctuate more, so that you can think about that as theory of taxes of savings for those type of households. And I think it is a bit of an empirical question how much taxes of savings of those households are being affected by tax competition.
Oh, that's a really good point, Roman. Thinking about when we were doing the Merley's review, it was almost one of the biggest characteristics of change since the early work is they're all closed economy models. And one reason we were went for the rate of return allowance or exemption, effectively a consumption tax in the end, was thinking a lot about capital mobility and a small open economy point. So I take that as that's an important point. Okay, well I think I'll just thank Alan and Mikhail for a terrific presentations, terrific papers. Thank you very much.